right. So, yeah, last week there was no class because I was in Switzerland. So I have like some pictures, so just to show, just cool trip. Basically, I was there speaking at this conference on like blockchain and stuff in the city called Zug. It's half an hour away from Zurich by train. So I've been to so like I mentioned earlier, like being at the first day of class, like I've been to Switzerland twice. Once to like German area, Zurich area, but that was like 8 years ago. And then last time I went recently was like more to like Geneva area, which is the French side. So it was cool going back to the German side this time when I knew like a lot more about the country and stuff. So that was interesting. And yeah, so cool thing about Zug is it's like I'll go over it in a later class on like industry, but it's commonly known as like Crypto Valley because like that this area is like sort of one of the main hubs for like blockchain and cryptocurrency stuff. So I thought it was really cool that I could pay. I paid for my train ticket with Bitcoin because that was super cool. It's like the train terminal I took a picture of, and Zug is just like a super beautiful city. Like I don't, these are just like my hotel was not hotel like Airbnb was like a block from the lake. This is this like cool statue that was there. Um, no,
But they didn't have statues.
yeah, that's what I found that was cool. Like there was a lot of like there were like very few like in the entire city there was like this one statue of like a guy like even like how I said like they don't memorialize like their war heroes and stuff like even on this like this is like part of the main area of like Old Town and they do have this like I actually don't know it was in German so I couldn't actually, I didn't I tried to like Google translate it but I couldn't read it but like even that is like an example of like memorializing the soldiers and stuff, which is kind of cool. Which I didn't realize that they did that much. One cool thing about this one is that you can like see that like the one main like statue that they have in the town is like mostly like cantonal pride. Like this is I have no clue who it is, but like if you can like you can see that like his shield that he's carrying and the like flag is like the Zug flag instead of the Swiss flag. So it's like a lot very like cantonal based pride and like yeah. That was a clock tower. You can like go up, and it was cool. Where like there was no like tour guides or anything. It just was literally like you just go like there was like a restaurant near that area, and I looked it up. There was like a sign there that said if you want to go into the clock tower, just go ask like someone at the restaurant for the key to it, and they just give you the key, and you just like go up by yourself. It is really cool and weird. This is the thing was also used as a jail. And this was like a wooden box, like a meter by a meter by a meter. And so I just went inside that little jail box. Yeah, this is the sunset there in Zug. This is one of those like fountains that was in like one of the video from the preparing for disasters thing, where like it has its own water supply that's like constantly running, which is kind of cool. One thing I found really weird, or curious that I meant to ask someone about, but I forgot, was in Zug, like next to the lake, there were like three flags. There was the Swiss flag, the Zug flag, and then also an EU flag, which I was very confused about. So I meant to ask someone, but I completely forgot about that. And then yeah, I also went around like Switzerland quite a bit. There's like a few pictures I took from the train. I went to this spot, which was the Rutli, which is like from the history lecture, like the spot where the three people like came together and created that, made the pact to make Switzerland, make the original confederation. So that was cool. Went to the Victorinox Swiss Army. Like Victorinox is one of the two companies that's like the Swiss Army company. So I went to where they make the Swiss Army knives, which is cool. What is this? Oh yeah, and I went to a chocolate place, and so I brought everyone chocolate. So, yeah, here, just open it and like pass it around. So yeah, yeah, that's it. So yeah, that's just about it for my trip. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. So yeah, today's lecture is going to be relatively pretty short, mostly because I didn't have that much time to prepare. Um, the diversity stuff will kind of carry over into next week as well. Like I know the readings were mostly off of like the religious diversity and stuff, which I will probably go into next week. This week I'll focus mostly on the linguistic stuff and kind of like go in depth about this paper that I wrote a few years ago, which kind of got me interested in Switzerland, and it's relevant to this topic. So a little bit about you know, we've been talking about this all throughout the class, but like Switzerland has multiple national languages, right? You have three main ones, which are German, French, and Italian, with a fourth one, Romansh, which is like super small and it's really only in that like one area. And you can see like the languages are kind of geographically isolated somewhat to an extent, where you have mostly French in the west, German in the east, and then like Italian in the south. Um, and a lot of like cultural diversity. A lot of the areas are like in the German, like the German speaking area that I was in. Like a lot of the culture there was influenced by like traditional German culture and stuff. Um, but one thing that's interesting about like Switzerland's like linguistic diversity is that despite the linguistic diversity, like there's never been no linguistic group in the country has ever tried to have any sort of secessionary movement. The one secessionary movement, as we know, was like back in 1847 with the Sonderbund Alliance, but that was mostly off of a religious split as well as a political split. Didn't have much to do with language. There were actually like both French and German cantons in the Sonderbund. No linguistic group has ever sought unification with linguistically similar neighbors. There's never been any sort of political parties formed around around like ethnicity, and in fact, like diversity is actually seen as a source of pride. It's actually one of like the main bases of Swiss nationalism. So, in this paper that I wrote 2 years ago, what I wanted, like freshman year, for history class was I wanted to compare. I didn't know much about Switzerland or Belgium, but this class was on nationalism, and so what I wanted to do is compare why Switzerland manages to maintain or how they manage to maintain this great cohesion despite having so many different languages. And so I wanted to compare it to a country that didn't do that. And there's a lot of countries in Europe that you could compare it to. We see situations going on with Spain. But I chose to go with Belgium just because I felt it was actually very similar to Switzerland, right? Like the population of Belgium is about 13 million. Switzerland is about 8.5 million. So, Belgium's a little bit more. The GDP per capita of Belgium is a little bit less than Switzerland's, but it's still an extremely wealthy country, and it has this interesting split as well, where you have like two major languages in the country, Dutch and French, with a third like minor language. In this case, the German is much less than Italian is in Switzerland, but it's I think the closest thing that I could find that best models the similar breakdown to Switzerland. Um, so, unlike Switzerland, though, Belgium actually faces an issue where they go through like frequent secessionary movements. So there's basically two sides. Like the French-speaking side of the country is called Walloons, and the Dutch-speaking side, Dutch, they also call it Flemish, is like their dialect of Dutch. That side of the country is called Flanders, and so like the region of Flanders, that's like their flag. And so they like constantly are going through many secessionary movements, trying to break away from Belgium. Major conflicts between the two sides. There are political parties based around like Flemish nationalism and even like secessionary movements, such as one called the New Flemish Alliance. And in 2010, there were 541 days without an active government because the two sides couldn't agree and come to how like a few years ago the U.S. government was like on shutdown for about 10 days or so. Like this lasted for like over a year and a half in Belgium just because the Flemish and the Walloons couldn't come to agreement on, a bunch of political decisions in the country. Um, so the question I really wanted to ask was about this creation of Swiss nationalism. So after the Sonderbund War, there was a desire to create a national identity. So, like we talked about, Napoleon came in and created this unitary state, which kind of fell apart pretty quickly. But then a lot of people wanted to they actually liked the somewhat of cohesion that that state provided. So they wanted to create a Swiss nation out of that. And so the problem was when they tried to do that, a lot of the southern cantons basically said, no, we don't want that. So they basically seceded. So after the Switzerland got the southern cantons back in, they still wanted to create this national identity, but they needed to have a different way to do it. And they couldn't do, for example, a common language, culture, or ethnicity, because, most European countries like nationalism. You look at Germany or Italian nationalism, French nationalism. They've usually been based around the idea of language or ethnicity, especially if you look into German, the history of German nationalism in the 19th century. And you couldn't actually infringe on local customs and education. So, for example, in France, it, there was a language called Occitan. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but very popular up till about 80, 90 years ago. But it's basically become close to a dead language at this point, just because what the French government did was forced all schools to adopt French as the language of education, and they basically nationalized the country by forcing a language upon everyone. And it ended up working pretty successfully for France, but just that just didn't work with the Swiss mindset, because the whole point of that Sonderbund alliance, so breaking away, was that they felt that the national government was putting too much control. So that's why they needed to do something different. So what they already had a common political identity, bound by their respect for direct democracy, federalism, political rights. But having a political unity isn't quite the same as having national unity. National unity, you need some. It's more abstract than just this idea of being a state. You need to have a common sense of national identity. And so what Switzerland did to achieve this is they did two main things, right? So what they did was there's a school of nationalism called ethno-symbolism, where what you do is you take symbols and basically assign meaning to them and create this stir this nationalistic memory where it may not have existed even. And so they took a lot of symbols they took this old coat of arms that from the 14th century and made it as the national flag. They created the Swiss National Day on August 1st, which was supposedly the day where the Confederation Pact happened. They created these old this old marching song that the Swiss Confederation used to use when going into battle. They turned that into the national anthem. They really pushed this concept of Alpine culture, where they basically said oh, we're all united based off of geography, and that's kind of what unites the country. They really glorified the folk heroes such as William Tell, and as well as the whole really immortalized and glorified the Confederation Pact that they did. And the interesting thing to notice about this is what they did was in 1847, when they were creating this national mindset, the Alps didn't just spring from the earth, or they didn't plant these false memories in people's mind of hearing folklore about William Tell when they were growing up. What they did was they took existing concepts and symbols and assigned nationalistic meaning to them, and basically it's not like trying to brainwash people. It was assigning new meaning to things that just hadn't existed before, and it allows people to come to their own reach this national unity by themselves. Um, So, going off now a little bit into like Belgian history, right? So, what happened was Belgium was part of the Netherlands, and they were a Belgium. The air in the region that is now Belgium, the French are a majority, but in the country of the Netherlands, they were a vast minority. The Dutch speakers were the vast majority in the Netherlands. And they actually had a secessionary movement in 1830 where they broke away from the Netherlands to create this Catholic country, which is now Belgium. And the thing that actually happened then is when they broke away, the French speakers suddenly went from being the minority in the Netherlands to being the majority in Belgium. And they really want, like, this is something that they hadn't experienced before. And they said, wow, this is amazing. Like, we want to really, like, push this French nationalism now. Like, this idea of, like, Frenchness. But the problem was, like, they were now the majority in Belgium, but the Dutch speakers in Belgium, there were a lot of Dutch-speaking Catholics who joined Belgium instead of the Netherlands. And by forcing this like frank francization, Frenchization, I don't know, they kind of really alienated the Dutch speakers, and the Dutch speakers felt like for the beginning of the country, like for the first almost 100 years, French was the only recognized language, and the Dutch speakers like weren't allowed to like speak Dutch in schools or anything, and this like kind of created a lot of resentment towards the French, and like from the very beginning, you had these seeds of like, discontent. Um, One thing that I find pretty interesting though is that the Belgian independence movement from the Netherlands is actually very similar to the Sonderbund independence movement from Switzerland. Both are like Southern Catholic secessionary movements based off of a lot of like political independence ideas. One thing I just realized a few hours ago, which I want to do some more research, is that the Belgian independence movement happened in 1830. The Sonderbund secessionary movement happened in 1847. I'm curious to go do some research to see if there's any like influences from like if the Sonderbund took like influence from the Belgian independence movement, because they are surprisingly similar. But anyways, that's a story for another time. Um, so yeah, basically like in the uh, school of thought of ethnosymbolism, nationalism, there's two what they call ethnies, which are like types of creating ethnosymbolism, where you have like this. I feel these terms are really weird for me, but the lateral ethnies are when you take ethnosymbolism from like elites and try to push it down onto people and like force people to adopt new symbols. And like an example of this, and the other one is the vertical ethnies, which is you take symbols that and myths that are already shared between the community, regardless of social positions, and you allow that to arise naturally. I just find it really weird because I feel the terms are like I don't know, should be really opposite to me. Like vertical to me sounds like pushing down from the top, but I don't know. That's just the terminology that's used in academia. Um, but like, so an example of that is that the like Belgian flag that they did, like I talked about, like all the Swiss symbology was already existed on. The problem with Belgium is that they didn't have this deep history to pull from. Switzerland, before becoming a single nation, was still like this confederation that had 5 centuries of history to call upon. Belgium, it had been switched hands very often over the past like couple of centuries. It was commonly nicknamed the battlefield of Europe. So they didn't really have their own like culture to draw upon. The Belgian flag was just like they made it in 1830 for the revolution as a change from the like French. It was based off of the French flag, and so you didn't have these sort of symbols to rally the people around. The symbols had to be, actually fabricated for the purpose of creating this nationalism, which made it not as effective as the Swiss type. And so the thing about the nationalists in Belgium and Switzerland is they both also fall into this school of thought called constructivism, and basically in constructivism, basically both sides constructivism basically says that language is not that important to creating national identity. But the thing is, Belgium and Switzerland interpreted this in two very different ways. Belgium basically said that, oh, if language isn't that important, it doesn't matter what we make the language. Let's just choose one thing and make it the national language and get everyone to rally around it. That's what they tried to do with French. The Swiss, on the other hand, said, okay, if language isn't that important, let's just not enforce anything at all. And they realized that language is actually important to the people, but it's not that important to creating a national identity. So what they did was went with this federalistic model of letting the cantons and the local communities have full control, and then they didn't try to enforce anything at the national level. Like the example I love giving with the name of the country is Confederatio Helvetica. It's a Latin word. It's a Latin name because they wanted to avoid choosing any specific language as the national language. Meanwhile, if you look at so that's actually the proportion of French speakers and Dutch speakers in the city of Brussels. And so basically this is like an example of how Frenchization happened, where in the city of Brussels back in 1866, there was only 20% speakers. But basically the Belgian government really pushed French as the main language until the point where French has overtaken the Dutch speakers. And that creates a lot of resentment in the Dutch communities in Belgium. Belgium claims to do this sort of federalistic model, where what they do is they basically the national government has drawn these regions and basically says, all right, so for the first 80, 90 years, they had French as the national language, but after that, there was so much infighting from the Dutch speakers that they finally had to agree to make Dutch also one of the national languages. And so after doing this, what they did was they kind of drew these lines on the map and said okay, this is the Dutch speaking area, this is the French speaking area, and they call this federalism. But if it's not the same kind of federalism that happens in Switzerland, where this is federalism that's forced from the top down. So if you were a Dutch speaker in the French-speaking zone, you still were forced to now learn French, and same the other way around. So instead of the model in Switzerland where you let the decisions be made at the bottom, you have this top-down decision making and they call it federalism. Yeah. And as always, economics does play a role as well. We're seeing that as well with Catalonia, where now if you look, so this in the dark blue is the unemployment. This is the unemployment levels for the Flemish region, and this is unemployment levels for Walloons. This is actually a very recent development. So historically, Walloons was usually the much more well-off area, but it was the more industrialized region of the country. But in the past 3-4 decades, manufacturing is not really the main source of European economies. So Flanders was much more into service sector and stuff. So since then, their economy has started doing much better, which just adds more reason for their secessionary movement. Same as Catalonia, where they're basically saying we're subsidizing the other regions way too much. And this is of course also true in Switzerland, where there are certain regions that have are doing much better economically than others. But then what it does come down to is this concept of nationalism, where if you see yourselves as one nation, as the Swiss do, it's much easier to convince people to redistribute the wealth somewhat, where the people, for example, the Italian-speaking region of Switzerland is much worse off economically than areas like Zurich and surrounding areas. But the people in Zurich are actually willing to send more aid to the Italian-speaking regions because they see themselves as a single Swiss nation. While in cases like this, the Flemish they don't see themselves as like benefiting. Like they're not sending it to Belgium. They're sending money to Walloons, which is like, why are we sending it to someone, to another nation basically? So that's, the nationalism and the economics kind of like really play into each other quite a bit. Um, Another issue is that Belgium was like ravaged by two world wars. World War One, they were trying to be neutral as well, but that didn't really work out that well for them. And so the external factors also did play a role. Another big issue is that the Nazis, when they overtook Belgium during World War Two, they really tried to push Flemish nationalism as a way to try to destabilize the existing government in Belgium. And so a lot of people cite this as like, this definitely helped make like the situation much worse because it gave a lot of power to the Flemish nationalistic movement. But I would actually argue that it didn't, because what actually happened was after World War II, the Flemish nationalistic movement was actually tarnished with like the legacy of Nazism. They had a lot of ties to Nazism, and because of that, Flemish nationalism kind of like died for like almost 20 years because it was had this like stigma behind it. So I don't know, I'll make the argument that Nazism actually probably kept the situation calmer than it would have otherwise. Um, but yeah, so and so honestly, at this point, like Belgium should not be one country. Like the split that's going on in Spain, like this is like much more deep rooted and like even more hatred between the two sides than it is than it is in Spain. One of the only things that's like keeping both sides together is if you look at this map. Oh no, too far. Yeah, so you have this what they call, this is the region of Brussels, where what's interesting actually is that it's in the Dutch speaking area, but it's actually now majority French speaking, but officially it's a like a multilingual city. And so it has this like weird limbo state between the two. And the problem is neither side really wants to give up control of the city of Brussels, because Brussels is an important city. It's the seat of the EU, and so that's probably one of the few things that's still holding the country together is that neither side is willing to give that up. Um, but yeah, and another thing that's actually interesting that's affecting both Switzerland and Belgium both is English is basically the lingua franca of the 20th and 21st century, where like when I went to Switzerland actually, um, remember how at the beginning of in the first few weeks I said that most people learn German as their first language and then they'll learn like French as their second language if they live in the German area. So I actually was talking to people in Switzerland. They're like, yeah, about 3 or 4 years ago they changed like in the canton of Zug and the canton of Zurich. They changed it so French is no longer the second language people learn in school, but it's actually English. And so this is actually happening like all throughout the country, where English is becoming the primary second language that people are learning. Because earlier it was actually usually the third language that people were learning. So, if you go into like the more urbanized areas, you can get away with English basically perfectly fine. And so that is actually having quite an effect on like these nationalistic identities that are based around ethnicity and language. Um, yeah, I'm not going to go into the Swiss religion stuff. I'll probably go into that next week. Yeah, that's about it. This is a pretty short lecture. Yeah, like I said, I was quite busy this past week and have as much time to prepare as I normally would have liked. Um, yeah, cool. Any questions? Yeah. Which one? There was no attendance link. There was, but I'm not taking attendance today. Yeah. Um, yeah. Oh, one interesting thing was I don't know if you so in the book I forgot which chapter it was in. You know how at the end he always does these like random topics like have nothing to do with the rest of the chapter. There was one he was talking about like what to do at a Swiss party where he said like you have to go introduce yourself to everyone like like before you even talk to anyone, you have to go introduce yourself to everyone. And I don't know. In my mind, it like okay, I'm like, okay, well, fine, whatever, that's okay. But I saw this actually happen in Switzerland, and it was the weirdest thing. Like I saw a bunch of like two groups that like they just like met each other at the train station, and they literally like went around saying like, "Hi, my name is this. Hi, my name is this." Like it's just the weirdest thing. It's just so abnormal to actually watch it in person. Yeah, that's all I have to say. Yeah, that's it. Also, take some more chocolate. I have a lot.